The Arizona sun hung low over the dusty town of Cedar Ridge, casting long shadows across the wooden platform as the 4:15 train wheezed to a stop. Steam hissed from the locomotive's belly while passengers shuffled toward the cars, their boots echoing against weathered planks. Sheriff Thomas Hayes adjusted his badge and pulled his hat brim lower, scanning the crowd with the practiced eye of a lawman who'd learned to read trouble before it announced itself. At 27, Thomas had the lean build of a man who'd spent years in the saddle and the steady gaze of someone who'd seen enough violence to appreciate peace. His brown hair was perpetually tousled by the desert wind, and his sun-weathered hands bore the calluses of both rope work and gunplay. Today, however, those hands trembled slightly as he approached the last car of the train. Sheriff Hayes, the conductor, a portly man with graying whiskers, wiped sweat from his forehead. "That Apache woman you asked about? She's in the rear car just like you requested. Been sitting there quiet as a church mouse since Tucson." Thomas nodded grimly. 3 days earlier, he'd received a telegram from the Indian agent in Tucson describing a young Apache woman who'd become separated from her people during the latest forced relocation to the San Carlos reservation. She'd been found wandering near the tracks, speaking little English, and carrying identification papers that were water-damaged beyond recognition. The agent requested that Thomas, known for his fair dealings with the local tribes, escort her to Cedar Ridge where a translator could help determine her origins. The rear car was nearly empty, save for an elderly prospector dozing in the corner and a woman sitting alone by the window. Thomas's breath caught as he saw her, not from any romantic inclination, but from the profound sadness that seemed to emanate from her small frame. Ayana, as she'd told the conductor her name was, appeared to be in her mid-20s, with long black hair braided with traditional beads, and wearing a mixture of Apache and white woman's clothing, a calico dress with beaded moccasins and turquoise jewelry. Her dark eyes held the hollow look of someone who'd lost everything familiar. "Ma'am," Thomas said softly, removing his hat as he approached, "I'm Sheriff Hayes. I'm here to help you get to where you need to go." Ayana looked up, her expression guarded but not hostile. She spoke in halting English, her voice barely above a whisper. "You help? Like others help?" There was bitter irony in her tone that made Thomas's chest tighten. "I give you my word. I'm here to help you find your family, not to cause you more pain," he said, settling into the seat across from her with deliberate slowness to avoid startling her. "Can you tell me anything about where your people might have gone?" As the train lurched into motion, Ayana began to speak in a mixture of Apache and broken English about her village, her family, and the day the soldiers came. Thomas listened intently, occasionally asking gentle questions, unaware that his own life was about to derail as thoroughly as hers had. Meanwhile, 3 cars forward, Margaret Hayes sat with her friend Eleanor Whitman, their shopping baskets filled with fabric and supplies from their day trip to the territorial capital. At 25, Margaret was considered one of the most beautiful women in Cedar Ridge, with auburn hair always perfectly arranged and green eyes that could flash with both warmth and fire. She wore her finest traveling dress, deep blue with ivory lace trim, and carried herself with the confidence of a woman who'd never doubted her place in the world. "I do hope Thomas remembers to pick up those medical supplies Doc Henley ordered," Margaret was saying when she noticed Eleanor's shocked expression. "What on earth are you staring at?" Eleanor leaned closer, her voice dropping to a scandalous whisper. "Margaret, dear, isn't that your husband back there, in the last car?" Margaret turned in her seat, craning her neck to peer toward the rear of the train. Through the connecting doors window, she could see Thomas's familiar profile, but he wasn't alone. He was leaning forward, speaking intently with a young Indian woman, his hat in his hands, and his expression more gentle and attentive than Margaret had seen in months. "Who is that woman?" Margaret's voice carried a sharp edge that made other passengers glance their way. "I couldn't say," Eleanor replied with barely concealed excitement, "but they certainly seem familiar with each other." Margaret's hands clenched in her lap, crumpling the fabric of her dress. In the 18 months since their marriage, Thomas had grown increasingly distant, spending long hours on patrol and speaking little about his work. She'd begun to wonder if he regretted their hasty courthouse wedding, if perhaps he'd married her more from duty than love after that passionate encounter behind the church social. Seeing him now, animated and caring in a way he rarely was with her anymore, felt like a knife twisting in her chest. The train swayed gently as it picked up speed, carrying all 3 toward a confrontation that would strip away pretenses and force each of them to confront truths they'd been avoiding. In the growing twilight, with the desert racing past the windows, None of them could have imagined how completely their lives were about to change. The train's whistle shrieked as it approached Cedar Ridge Station, but the sound was nothing compared to the storm brewing in Margaret Hayes' heart. For the past hour, she'd watched through the connecting windows as her husband continued his intimate conversation with the Apache woman, their heads bent close together, as if sharing secrets. Every gentle gesture from Thomas, every moment he spent listening to the woman's halting words, felt like a betrayal burning through Margaret's chest. "Perhaps there's an innocent explanation," Eleanor whispered, though her tone suggested she hoped for anything but innocence. The older woman's eyes gleamed with the anticipation of scandal, something to enliven the tedious social fabric of their small frontier town. "Innocent?" Margaret's voice was barely controlled fury. "My husband disappears for 3 days on official business, and I find him cozied up with some... She couldn't finish the sentence, the words too ugly to speak aloud, though they screamed in her mind. As the train shuddered to a halt, passengers began gathering their belongings and moving toward the exits. Margaret rose abruptly, her careful composure finally cracking. "I won't sit here and pretend I didn't see what I saw." She pushed past other passengers with uncharacteristic rudeness, her skirts swishing angrily as she made her way toward the rear car. Eleanor followed, practically bouncing with excitement at the drama about to unfold. Thomas was helping Ayanna to her feet when he looked up to see his wife standing in the doorway of the car, her face flushed with rage and her green eyes blazing. Behind her, he could see Eleanor and several other townspeople who'd been on the train, all watching with hungry curiosity. "Margaret," he said, surprise and confusion evident in his voice. "I didn't know you were on the train. I thought you weren't coming back until tomorrow." "Don't." Margaret's voice cut through his words like a blade. "Don't you dare try to explain this away with your lies." Ayanna shrank back against the window, sensing the hostility radiating from the white woman, even though she couldn't fully understand the English words. Her dark eyes darted between Thomas and Margaret, and she murmured something in Apache that sounded like an apology. "Margaret, you don't understand," Thomas said, stepping toward his wife with his hands raised peacefully. "This is official business. This woman needs help." "Official business?" Margaret's laugh was bitter and sharp. "Is that what you call it? 3 days away on patrol, and this is what you were really doing? Carrying on with her?" The word "her" dripped with such venom that even the other passengers shifted uncomfortably. Thomas felt his own temper beginning to rise, both at his wife's accusations and at the cruel tone she used when referring to Ayanna. "That's enough, Margaret. You're making a scene, and you're dead wrong about what's happening here." "Am I?" Margaret stepped fully into the car now, her voice rising to carry to the gathered crowd. "Then explain to everyone why you're here, alone with this Apache woman, looking at her like you never look at me anymore." The words hung in the air like gunsmoke. Thomas felt every eye on the train burning into him, saw the mixture of shock and judgment on the faces of his neighbors. In the frontier society of Cedar Ridge, reputation was everything, and Margaret's public accusation was the equivalent of branding him with a hot iron. Ayanna spoke then, her voice small but clear. "Sheriff, good man, help me find my people." She looked directly at Margaret, her eyes holding a dignity that seemed to surprise the angry woman. "No bad thing, only help." "Don't you dare speak to me!" Margaret whirled on Ayanna with such fury that Thomas instinctively moved between them. "You have no right." "She has every right," Thomas said, his voice now carrying the steel that had made him respected as a lawman. "Every right to be treated with basic human decency, which is more than you're showing right now." Margaret recoiled as if he'd slapped her. In all their time together, Thomas had never spoken to her with such coldness, had never defended another woman against her. The pain in her eyes was evident, but it only fueled her rage. "How dare you take her side against your own wife?" Margaret's voice broke on the last word, revealing the hurt beneath the anger. "In front of the whole town, you're defending her against me." The conductor appeared in the doorway, clearly uncomfortable with the domestic drama unfolding in his train. "Folks, we need to clear the car now. Train's got to be cleaned and ready for the evening run." But nobody moved. The confrontation had reached a boiling point that demanded resolution. Thomas looked between his wife's tear-streaked face and Ayanna's frightened expression, feeling the weight of an impossible situation. Every word he spoke seemed to dig the hole deeper. Every gesture was misinterpreted. Behind Margaret, he could see the faces of people he'd served faithfully as sheriff, some sympathetic, others judgmental, all of them witnesses to his humiliation. "We're going home," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "All of us. We'll sort this out in private, like civilized people." But Margaret shook her head violently. "I'm not going anywhere with her. You made your choice, Thomas Hayes. Live with it." She pushed past him and off the train, Eleanor hurrying behind her like a faithful hound. The other passengers began to disperse, whispering among themselves, already spreading the story that would be on every tongue in Cedar Ridge by nightfall. Thomas stood in the empty car with Ayanna, the weight of his badge suddenly feeling heavier than ever. Outside he could hear Margaret's sobs as Eleanor led her away, and he knew that whatever he'd hoped to accomplish by helping this lost Apache woman, he'd succeeded only in losing his wife in the process. The desert wind whistled through the open train doors, carrying with it the promise of storms ahead. The Hayes house sat on Elm Street like a monument to shattered dreams. Once the pride of Cedar Ridge's respectable married couples, the white clapboard home with its carefully tended rose garden now felt as cold as a tomb. Margaret had locked herself in the bedroom for 2 days, refusing to speak to Thomas or accept the meals he left outside her door. The only sounds that escaped were the occasional muffled sobs that tore at his heart more than any bullet ever could. Thomas sat at his kitchen table, staring at the untouched coffee growing cold in his hands. The morning sun streamed through lace curtains Margaret had sewn during their first months of marriage, back when she'd believed their love could conquer anything the frontier threw at them. Now, those same curtains seemed to mock him with memories of happier times. A sharp knock at the door interrupted his brooding. He opened it to find Doc Henley, the town's physician, and one of the few men whose opinions still carried weight with him. "Thomas," the older man said, removing his hat as he entered, "I came to check on Margaret. Eleanor Whitman's been spreading tales all over town, and I figured someone ought to hear the truth from you." "The truth?" Thomas laughed bitterly. "The truth is that I tried to help someone who needed it, and I've managed to destroy my marriage and my reputation in the process." Doc Henley settled into a chair, his weathered face showing concern. At 62, he'd seen enough frontier drama to recognize the difference between guilt and innocence. "Tell me what really happened, son. All of it." Thomas poured himself a fresh cup of coffee and began the story from the beginning. The telegram from Tucson, the request to help locate Ayanna's family, the long train ride during which she'd slowly opened up about her losses. He described how she'd been separated from her people during a government relocation, how she'd wandered for days eating nothing but wild berries and creek water, how she'd wept when she spoke of her young son who died of fever in the government camp. "She's not some romantic interest, Doc. She's a woman who's lost everything, and I'm probably the only person in this territory who might be able to help her find what family she has left." Doc Henley nodded thoughtfully. "Where is she now?" "I got her a room at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, paid for a week, figured that would give me time to contact the reservation agents and track down her people." Thomas ran his hands through his hair. "But now the whole town's convinced I'm having an affair, and Margaret won't even look at me." Upstairs, a door creaked open. Both men looked up as Margaret appeared at the top of the stairs, still in her nightgown and robe, her auburn hair hanging loose and disheveled. Her face was pale and blotchy from crying, but her eyes held a fierce determination. "Don't talk about me like I'm not here," she said, her voice hoarse but steady. She descended the stairs slowly, her bare feet silent on the wooden steps. "And don't act like this is just about helping some poor lost woman." "Margaret," Thomas stood, relief flooding through him at seeing her emerge from her self-imposed exile. "Please let me explain." "Explain what?" She moved to the opposite side of the room, keeping the kitchen table between them like a barricade. "Explain why you couldn't tell your own wife you were escorting another woman. Explain why you looked at her with more tenderness than you've shown me in months." Doc Henley cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Perhaps I should go." "No," Margaret said firmly. "Stay. Maybe an objective witness will help my husband remember how to tell the truth." The accusation hit Thomas like a physical blow. "I've never lied to you, Margaret. Not once in our marriage. Haven't you?" Margaret's eyes flashed with renewed anger. "When you disappear for days at a time on these mysterious patrols, when you come home exhausted and won't talk about where you've been, when you turn away from me in bed like touching me is some kind of burden." Thomas felt heat rising in his cheeks. These were private matters, not meant for outside ears, but Margaret seemed past caring about propriety. "I work hard to keep this town safe," he said quietly. "I thought you understood that." "I understood that my husband was dedicated to his job. What I didn't understand was that dedication included secret meetings with beautiful young women." "She's not—" Thomas stopped himself, realizing that any description of Ayana's appearance would only deepen Margaret's suspicions. "This isn't about her looks, Margaret. It's about doing what's right." "What's right?" Margaret's voice rose again. "What's right is being honest with your wife. What's right is not embarrassing her in front of the entire town. What's right is not making her feel like she married a stranger." The words hung heavy in the air. Doc Henley looked between them, seeing a marriage that had been cracking long before this incident brought it to a breaking point. "Margaret," the doctor said gently, "have you considered that maybe this isn't really about the Apache woman? Maybe this is about you and Thomas needing to talk about things you've been avoiding?" Margaret turned on him with surprising venom. "Don't you psychoanalyze me, Doc Henley. I know what I saw on that train. I know how my husband looked at another woman, and I know how it felt to be treated like I didn't matter." Thomas stepped toward her, his hands outstretched in supplication. "You matter more than anything in this world, Margaret. You have to know that." "Do I?" Tears began streaming down her face again. "Because for months now, I've felt like I'm living with a ghost. You go through the motions of being my husband, but your heart isn't here. Maybe it never was." The accusation struck deeper than any physical wound. Thomas felt something fundamental breaking inside him, some essential belief about his marriage and his own character. "That's not true," he whispered. "Isn't it?" Margaret wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "When's the last time you told me you loved me without me saying it first? When's the last time you looked forward to coming home to me? When's the last time you chose me over your duty as sheriff?" Thomas opened his mouth to respond but found no words. The terrible truth was that Margaret wasn't entirely wrong. He had been distant, had been treating their marriage like another obligation rather than the source of joy it had once been. Outside, the morning sun climbed higher, but inside the Hayes house, shadows seemed to deepen. Doc Henley rose slowly, recognizing that his presence was no longer helpful. "I'll check on you both later," he said quietly. "And Thomas, that woman at Mrs. Patterson's place is going to need more than a week to sort out her situation. You might want to think about what comes next." After he left, Thomas and Margaret stood facing each other across their kitchen, the distance between them feeling wider than the desert that surrounded their town. Both had spoken truths that couldn't be taken back, and both were beginning to understand that their marriage had been in trouble long before Ayana ever stepped onto that train. The question now was whether they could find their way back to each other, or if some bridges, once burned, could never be rebuilt. 3 days after their devastating confrontation, Margaret Hayes found herself standing outside Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. The morning air was crisp with the promise of autumn, and the cottonwoods along Main Street rustled with golden leaves that reminded her of happier times. She clutched a basket of food, fresh bread, preserves, and cold chicken, though she wasn't entirely sure why she'd prepared it. Mrs. Patterson, a stern widow who ran the cleanest establishment in Cedar Ridge, answered the door with obvious surprise. "Mrs. Hayes, I wasn't expecting—" "That is, how can I help you? I'd like to speak with your guest," Margaret said, the words feeling strange on her tongue. "The Apache woman." Mrs. Patterson's eyebrows rose nearly to her hairline. The entire town had been buzzing about the train station incident, and most folks had taken sides, some supporting their sheriff, others condemning what they saw as improper behavior. "I'm not sure that's wise, dear. Perhaps you should speak with your husband first." "My husband isn't here," Margaret interrupted, surprising herself with her firmness. "And this is something I need to do myself." The older woman studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Room 3, upstairs. But I'll be nearby if there's any trouble." Margaret climbed the narrow stairs, each step feeling like a small act of courage. She'd spent 3 sleepless nights wrestling with her demons, and somewhere in the darkness of the 3rd night, she'd realized that her anger was poisoning not just her marriage, but her own soul. She knocked softly on the door marked with a brass 3. A quiet voice responded in Apache, then switched to English. "Come." Margaret opened the door to find Ayana sitting by the window, mending a torn piece of fabric with careful stitches. The Apache woman looked up with wariness, her dark eyes reflecting the same exhaustion that Margaret felt in her bones. "Mrs. Sheriff wife?" Ayana said carefully, setting down her needlework. "You come." "Why?" Margaret stepped into the small, neat room, noting how little space Ayana's few possessions occupied, a single change of clothes, a worn leather pouch, and what appeared to be a child's moccasin, carefully preserved. "I came to—" Margaret paused, realizing she'd rehearsed this conversation a dozen times, but none of her prepared words seemed adequate. "I came to apologize. Ayana's eyebrows rose slightly. Apologize. For what I said at the train station. For how I treated you. Margaret set the basket on the small table and took a tentative step closer. You were just a person needing help, and I made you feel unwelcome. The Apache woman studied her for a long moment, her expression unreadable. You think your husband and me together? Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. Yes, I did think that. Why? The simple question cut straight to the heart of Margaret's turmoil. She sank into the room's single chair, suddenly feeling the weight of her own insecurities. Because he looked at you the way he used to look at me, she admitted quietly, like you mattered to him, like helping you was the most important thing in his world. Ayana nodded slowly, understanding flickering in her eyes. Your husband, good man, kind heart, but you hurt inside, long time hurt, yes? Margaret's throat tightened. Yes, my husband, Ayana said softly, picking up the child's moccasin and cradling it gently. Dead 2 winters past. Soldiers shoot him when he tried to protect our son. She paused, her voice growing thick with grief. My boy, he died from white man's sickness in the camp where they keep us. He was 4 summers old. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. I'm so sorry. Your husband, he listened to my pain. He not judge. He not say my people deserve what happened. Ayana met Margaret's gaze directly. He hear my heart when it break, like medicine for wounded spirit. The simplicity and honesty of the explanation struck Margaret like lightning. This woman wasn't a rival for her husband's affections. She was a person drowning in grief who'd found a momentary life preserver in Thomas's compassion. I've been so jealous, Margaret whispered, so angry that he cared about someone else's problems when I felt like he'd stopped caring about mine. What problems you have? Ayana asked gently. Margaret laughed bitterly. Nothing like yours, nothing real, just feeling like the man I married was disappearing bit by bit, like I was becoming less important to him every day. Ayana set down the moccasin and leaned forward slightly. In my tribe, when marriage have trouble, women talk to each other, help each other see truth. You talk to husband about your heart? We tried, but it always ends in fighting. He says I don't understand his work. I say he doesn't understand my loneliness, round and round getting nowhere. Maybe, Ayana said thoughtfully. Both right. Both wrong, too. Margaret looked up, surprised by the woman's insight. What do you mean? Your husband, he carry heavy weight. Sheriff work. See bad things. Stop bad people. Always worry about town safety. Maybe he protect you from knowing how hard it is. Margaret considered this. Thomas did seem more burdened lately, more prone to staring off into the distance as if wrestling with unseen demons. But you right too, Ayana continued. Wife need husband's heart, not just his duty. Need to know she matter most, even when world is heavy. The 2 women sat in comfortable silence for a moment, an unlikely bridge of understanding forming between them. Margaret reached into her basket and offered Ayana a piece of bread, which the Apache woman accepted with a grateful nod. Can I ask you something? Margaret said finally. Yes. What will you do if Thomas can't find your family? Ayana's face grew sad, but resigned. Then I learn to live alone. Find work maybe. Learn more English. Make new life from broken pieces. Margaret felt a stab of admiration for this woman's quiet courage. Here was someone who'd lost everything, husband, child, home, people, and still faced the future with dignity. A knock at the door interrupted them. Mrs. Patterson's voice called out, Mrs. Hayes, your husband's here looking for you. Margaret and Ayana exchanged glances, and something passed between them. Not friendship exactly, but a mutual recognition of shared womanhood and the burdens they both carried. I suppose it's time to face him, Margaret said, rising from her chair. Your husband love you, Ayana said quietly. I see it in his eyes when he speak your name. But love need words and time and choosing each other every day. Margaret paused at the door, looking back at this woman who'd inadvertently held up a mirror to her marriage. Thank you. For what? For helping me see what I was really angry about. Margaret descended the stairs to find Thomas waiting in Mrs. Patterson's parlor, his hat in his hands and anxiety written across his features. When he saw her, relief flooded his face. Margaret, I was worried when you weren't at home. Eleanor said she saw you heading this way. We need to talk, Thomas, Margaret interrupted gently. Really talk. About everything. He nodded, sensing something had shifted in her demeanor. About Ayana? About us, Margaret corrected. About what we've lost, and what we might still be able to save. As they walked home together through the dusty streets of Cedar Ridge, both knew they were facing the hardest conversation of their marriage, but for the first time in months, they were facing it together. 2 weeks later, the Hayes house buzzed with an energy it hadn't felt in months. Margaret hummed softly as she packed a lunch basket, while Thomas checked his saddlebags and rifle one final time. Outside, 3 horses waited in the crisp autumn morning, 2 for the Hayes couple and 1 for Ayanna, who stood quietly by the gate in traditional Apache dress, her few belongings secured in a leather pack. "You sure about this, Margaret?" Thomas asked, though his tone held hope rather than concern. "It's a 2-day ride to the San Carlos reservation, and we'll be camping rough." Margaret tied a bonnet under her chin and smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since the train station incident. "I'm sure. Besides, someone needs to make certain you two don't get lost trying to read Apache trail signs." Their long conversation 2 weeks earlier had lasted until dawn, with both of them laying bare years of accumulated hurts, fears, and misunderstandings. Thomas had finally admitted how the violence and corruption he'd witnessed as sheriff had made him withdraw emotionally, trying to protect Margaret from the darkness of his work. Margaret had confessed her growing loneliness and her fear that she was becoming merely a convenient arrangement, rather than a beloved wife. The healing hadn't been instant or easy. There had been tears, arguments, and moments when both wondered if the damage was too severe to repair. But gradually, they'd begun to rediscover the people they'd fallen in love with, and more importantly, they'd started building the foundation for who they wanted to become together. Ayanna approached them, her expression mixing gratitude with nervous anticipation. Through patient conversations with Father Miguel, the town's priest who spoke some Apache, they'd finally pieced together her full story. Her name was Ayanna Delche, daughter of a respected medicine woman, and Thomas had managed to locate her maternal uncle among the families at San Carlos. Whether she'd be welcomed back after her long absence remained uncertain, but it was her best chance at rebuilding a life among her people. "I never thank you proper," she said to Margaret in her carefully practiced English. You help me understand white woman's heart. Help me see good marriage can heal from bad hurt." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "You helped me too, Ayanna, more than you know." Thomas swung up into his saddle and looked back at the town that had watched their private drama unfold with such hungry curiosity. Some folks still whispered when they saw the 3 of them together, but increasingly, the talk had shifted from scandal to admiration. Doc Henley had made sure the true story circulated, and even Eleanor Whitman had grudgingly admitted she might have jumped to conclusions. "Ready?" Thomas asked. The 2 women mounted their horses, and together they rode out of Cedar Ridge into the vast Arizona territory. The desert landscape stretched endlessly before them, painted in shades of gold and rust under the climbing sun. They followed old trading paths and cattle trails, stopping at watering holes that Ayanna identified with the confidence of someone raised in this harsh but beautiful land. On the first night, camped under a canopy of stars that seemed close enough to pluck from the sky, Margaret watched Thomas and Ayanna discussing the constellations in a mixture of English and Apache words. There was nothing romantic in their interaction, just the easy companionship of 2 people who'd found common ground in their respect for this unforgiving country. "Thomas," Margaret said as they settled into their bedrolls, "I owe you an apology too." He looked up from where he was banking their small fire. "For what? For not trusting you, for assuming the worst instead of asking questions, for caring more about what other people thought than about the truth." Thomas moved to lie beside her, close enough that she could feel his warmth in the cool desert night. "We both made mistakes, Margaret, but maybe this whole mess was what we needed to start talking to each other again." Margaret turned to face him, seeing her husband clearly for the first time in months. "I love you, Thomas Hayes, the man who helps lost people find their way home, the man who does what's right even when it costs him, the man who married me." "I love you too," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "And I promise no more protecting you from my work, no more shutting you out when things get difficult. We're partners in this life, all of it." They kissed then, soft and tentative at first, then with growing passion as they rediscovered the connection that had brought them together. Nearby, Ayanna lay with her back to them, giving them privacy while she stared up at the same stars her ancestors had used to navigate this desert for countless generations. The next day brought them to the boundaries of the San Carlos Reservation, a sprawling settlement that housed multiple Apache bands in conditions far from ideal. Government buildings clustered near the center, surrounded by traditional wickiups and makeshift shelters that spoke of a people adapting to circumstances not of their choosing. Thomas presented his credentials to the Indian agent, a harried-looking man named Carlson, who seemed genuinely relieved to have one less problem case on his hands. Within an hour, they'd located Ayana's uncle, an elderly man named Nalnish, whose weathered face broke into joy when he recognized his sister's daughter. The reunion was emotional, but private, conducted in rapid Apache that neither Thomas nor Margaret could follow. When Ayana finally turned back to them, tears streamed down her face, but her expression held peace for the first time since they'd met her. "My uncle says my grandmother still lives," she told them. "She has grieved for me as dead, but now there is hope again." Margaret found herself crying as well, moved by the simple miracle of a family reunited against impossible odds. Thomas shook hands with Nalnish, who spoke a few words of thanks in heavily accented English. As they prepared to leave, Ayana pressed something into Margaret's hands, a small beaded bracelet worked in intricate patterns of blue and white. "My mother made this," she explained, "for protection on long journeys, for you and your husband, who travel together now with open hearts." The ride back to Cedar Ridge passed in comfortable silence, both Thomas and Margaret lost in their own thoughts. They'd set out to help a stranger find her way home, and had ended up finding their way back to each other. As the familiar buildings of their town came into view, Margaret reached over and took Thomas's hand. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "About how lucky we are," he replied, "to have each other, to have a second chance, to live in a place where we can make a difference." "And?" Thomas grinned, the boyish expression she'd fallen in love with returning to his weathered features. "And about how much I'm looking forward to sleeping in our own bed tonight." Margaret laughed, the sound carrying across the desert like music. "Thomas Hayes, you romantic. Only for you, Mrs. Hayes. Only for you." As they rode into Cedar Ridge with the setting sun at their backs, both knew their marriage would face other challenges. The frontier was unforgiving, and the work of building a life together required constant attention and care. But they also knew they'd proven something important to themselves and to their community, that love, like the desert itself, could survive almost anything if tended with patience, honesty, and unwavering commitment. The story of the sheriff, his wife, and the Apache woman would be told in Cedar Ridge for years to come, but the version that endured wasn't about scandal or betrayal. It was about the courage required to look past appearances, the wisdom needed to heal old wounds, and the redemptive power of choosing love over fear, even when, especially when, that choice demanded everything they had to give.